Camera's rolling.
Camera's rolling. Okay, sweet. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming and thanks for hosting me. It's so great. So I'd explained that it would be so nice to get a recorded version of this so that people don't have to read through that whole book. And it's turned into, I don't know, it's another chance to share one's work, and it's a privilege. And I mean, a lot of time goes into it, and I hope that maybe you can get something out of this. And so this was my Master of Science in Landscape Architecture thesis. I finished it in November. And it was a research-based design thesis. And so what most of us students do is we do research, and then our design is then grounded in the outcomes of that research. And so both of you have done a thesis. Have most of you written a thesis or no? Okay, so if you have, you know the process, and if you haven't, you might think, oh wow, that's a bit of a complicated way to approach an assignment. But yeah, we'll go through it together. Okay. So like I said, we do research and then design, but the way that I'll talk you through this is we'll start with the design and then go back to explain the research that led up to it. And so I'll first begin with explaining the site and then take you through the journey of the design. And so, tribute to a glacier. So the glacier that we're paying tribute to is the Haupapa Tasman Glacier. It's way in the distance over there in Aoraki Mount Cook National Park in New Zealand. If we were to go back 35 years, the glacier would have come all the way to the front of this image. So it's retreating at a rapid rate. If you see it from the side, I mean, it's a colossal thing. It's 23 kilometers long, and the terminus face here is 50 meters. And it's been, at first it began with down wasting, and then it's been going back at about 200, and even last year 400 meters, retreating back in a single year. But I mean, the scale of this place is huge. It's almost, you can't even comprehend it from that image. So there it is. It's in the Southern Alps. It's one of 3 glaciers that are heavily visited for tourism. So you can see where it is there. And to give you a little context, in Aoraki Mount Cook National Park, it's an iconic national park. If you go to New Zealand, you really have to visit. And here's the glacier with the lake there, the Tasman Lake. And here on this side is the tallest mountain in New Zealand, Aoraki Mount Cook. And give you a little more context again, and because it's part of a much bigger system, it then feeds into the Tasman River and then into Lake Pukaki, which was the glacier's farthest extent in the previous ice age. And this then powers a hydro dam that feeds into a canal and then irrigates the Mackenzie Valley district. So now I'll take you through the design, and the way I'll explain it is as if I'm a visitor going to this park for the first time. So you can walk with me on it. So this is the site. If you look at the whole thing to reacquaint you, there's Lake Pukaki. And so I'm a visitor. I'm coming from Christchurch. I've driven now 4 hours to the southeast, and I've heard now that you actually can't drive into the park anymore. So I take a right turn. I'm intrigued to what this means because this is something new. This is the design intervention. So I turn the corner, and there it is. I drive under this, what they call a pauenua. It's a Maori landmark. It marks a significant space, at least that's what the ranger told me. And they say they put it there because that was the farthest extent of this glacier. So I drive in, and then I turn left because that's where I park the car, and I now pack my stuff and I take the shuttle. So I slowly ascend, and the mountains climb up on both sides, and the driver's saying things, but honestly I'm not really listening because, I mean, it's stunning. That landscape, it's totally humbling. After half an hour, I arrive at the visitor center, which is where I step out, and here they introduced me to what's going on. It turns out that I'm actually standing in the glacial valley, and they explain that I can look and see into the Tasman Valley there and the Hooker Valley, and if I look back, I see where I've come from. And it's funny I'm now learning about retreat, and I'm learning about being in this bigger system, and I don't know, I'm curious, I feel a bit responsible, but I want to go see this glacier for myself. So I've heard you can rent bikes, so I put my stuff away, grab a bike, and make my way up to the beginning of the trail. So I'm riding my bike, and it feels so good to be outside. Been in the car all day. I can feel the wind, and I can see the trailhead in the distance. And there it is. This is where I can park my bike, and I can see up this moraine. I guess that's where I'm going up to. It's pretty big. I suppose I'll be ascending that set of stairs. And so this is where I am. I just started, and I see another one of these markers. Okay, this must be it. I'll take the walk. So I walk up these stairs, and I'm getting pretty tired. There's a lot of it. It's kind of a grind. And then I almost get to the top, and the staircase narrows and it straightens out. And then there it is. These two boulders rise up, and in the distance I can see this old gritty glacier, and it's so far away. I want to get closer, so I step down onto the viewing platform, and I see that there's a really long staircase that's now going to take me down. Okay, it's narrow. I'll do it, and step by step, rhythmically, I make my way down. And then I get to the bottom, and I want to turn around and see where I've come from, so I turn around, and well, now I'm a mustached male, but I look into this mirror and see my own reflection, and there it is. It's this glacier's behind me with these mountains and this sky, and well, I'm in it, and it's fading, and I'm fading. We're all kind of fading. Shake it off, keep walking, and then take another look back to see where I've come from, and wow, I mean, we are just so small in comparison to it all. And I follow, and this path turns into this pier that extends out into the water. It makes me want to touch the water, so I do, and it's freezing cold. And then when I look up, I see this floating sculpture. I'd heard about this. It's supposed to be a programmable sculpture. And at that point, I notice a helicopter flying over. And so that's the thing, is this is a heavily trafficked tourist destination, so these helicopters fly over pretty regularly. And this is disruptive. And so as a designer, I'm now describing again, there's nothing I can do about this sound. But what if we can transform the sound and turn it into something meaningful as opposed to something disruptive? And so I'll play you a quick recording of first what the helicopter sounds like, and then a proposal of what could it sound like if you transformed this into maybe something meaningful. So here we go. So first 30 seconds. So in a kind of quiet, melancholic days, I continue walking along the water, over the rocks, past a few small ponds, and make my way back to the bike. So I'm pretty tired now, physically and emotionally, but I feel calmer than I have in a while. So that's now I'll go back and explain how we actually got there. How did we get to this design? I'll try not to make this too long or too academic, but take you through what I perceive to be the challenge, and then the questions I asked in connection to that, some of the findings, and then end with a few concluding words. So yeah, you guessed it, climate change. The scientists have been ringing alarm bells on retreating glaciers for a long time. You know, communities are going to be impacted. There's going to be major implications. And this is popping up everywhere. And so I thought, okay, this is interesting. What can this mean? Some of these implications, probably familiar, but rising sea levels, irrigation, tourism, and flood hazards, mudslides. And then implications for New Zealand in particular, it's primarily tourism. And so, especially with ski terrain access and front country visitors, and mountain access in general, and a sense of identity. So there is, for some of the West Coast glaciers, flood risk as well. And in terms of irrigation and hydropower, that's something much longer term. So that's much more of a question mark. And so I was very surprised actually to find very few landscape architects addressing these questions, almost none on glacial retreat, which is, we pride ourselves in being a profession that can tackle complicated problems. And so I thought, okay, this is interesting. The only initiatives I could find were things like artificial glaciers and blankets being put over them, and suggestions for propping ice shelves up on underwater platforms. But in general, and from the public too, a lack of engagement. And so there's some concepts emerging in the social sciences and in psychology. And in particular, I'll bring your attention to the second one, environmental melancholia, coined by an environmental psychologist. So we'll get back to that. So I thought this was then the intersection I chose to address, is this lack of engagement from a psychological perspective on glacier retreat, and how can landscape architecture provide a meaningful response to this. And so the theoretical framework that underpinned this research was, like I said, came from environmental melancholia. And so what is that? It's this theory that there's an unresolved or almost stuck form of mourning that then prevents people from acting in relation to environmental degradation in general. And what makes this theory interesting is it addresses the loss of an environment or the loss of an object, whereas psychology usually talks about loss in terms of interpersonal relationships, so losing somebody. And I think this can be relevant much beyond glaciers. It goes into all forms of degradation, which is what she addresses. And so in order to move beyond that, to accept melancholy and accept these complex emotions in space and in forms of decision making, science in general is pretty uncomfortable with it, because we like to shine a harsh light and focus on the rational, and sometimes these things are much more difficult to explain. And so I hypothesized that there was this experience with this glacier, and that maybe there's something I could do with that. So I asked then some questions, how do people experience this retreat? And then went into, from a landscape perspective, how can an aesthetic experience provide a response? So research into some form of an abstract framework for how you could approach this, and then how could you turn these abstract principles into something site-specific. And so that would be then design guidelines, and then this would lead to the design. And it seems linear and methodical, but in reality, it's totally iterative, and it's messy, and they all happen at the same time, but that's what makes it interesting, and then you break it down into something clear afterwards. And so in terms of people's experience, I hardly had to say anything. People wanted to share their stories and how they felt, and there was, you know, a sense of disappointment with how tourists were behaving, sense of losing an icon, sense of feeling powerless because you can't solve something at something like this at a local scale, so it's very difficult. And then there's also this ambivalence, this feeling of guilt, you know, that I want to drive to get to this beautiful place. So I have these two things at odds with each other, and the rangers, for instance, conservation values versus commercialization, which earns people money. And but in general, what was clear is that everybody cared and everybody wanted to get involved and do something, and that was a real takeaway for me. That so a few of the findings then was I'd started looking at this glacier, but really it's symptomatic of something much bigger. So when addressing it from a landscape perspective, don't just look at that, look at the whole system. And then internally too, we talk about melancholy and sadness, but the moment you get into that, people are reflecting again internally on a larger scale. And so that then, you know, a form of contemplation. So larger internal and larger external processes. And so conclusions for an aesthetic approach, melancholy accompanied by contemplation. And so use landscape to foster a certain type of contemplation, a contemplation with the focus on this object of melancholy, this glacier. And so this is where we get that intersection. And so what can melancholy and contemplation do? Well, melancholy is a loving regard for something that you lose, so it spurs a compassion. And then, yes, we need action, but it has to be grounded. And so a balanced person needs both, so to take a step back and reflect, and then use that to ground a meaningful form of action. And then the aesthetics, or that the perception of space, you saw that I didn't propose a solution necessarily, I proposed an experience. And that in terms of a dialogue about sustainability, that the experience of space can actually shift consciousness and foster care that can change behavior. And so this is to get into that aesthetic framework. I broke down, you know, what is contemplation, and it's something progressive, it's not instantaneous. And so that there are aesthetic properties in space that can contribute to creating certain mental states, so that you move through these mental states into one of contemplation. And don't worry too much about what you see on the screen, because it takes a little bit to wrap your head around it. And then this was then the framework that I developed, and I won't get into it. It'll come out in 2 examples that I'll now explain. So again, this is abstract, and then I went into a process of making this site-specific. And so how do you turn something abstract into something site-specific? Well, you study the site, and then you find the challenges and opportunities for this framework within the place that you're looking at, and then come up with these guidelines that are by no means the only one. They're a starting point, they're a place to draw inspiration. So I found 4 guidelines for the whole site. So I looked at the scale of the park and then the scale of the glacier. And so I'll just draw on one, the kind of the backbone of all of them. And so that was this notion of slowness, and in this particular site of that modal shift. So this was what you experienced moving from being in a car and then progressing into slower and slower modes of transportation. And so how it now is that you can drive right up to the trailhead. But this idea of slowing down requires a commitment from the visitors. There's going to be people that aren't going to enjoy it. It's going to be a little irritating at first because we're used to being able to get these quickly. But there's then the reward of a lasting emotional experience. And they say that, or I read this quote, that there's a secret bond between slowness and memory and between speed and forgetting. And so that's something that stuck with me when I made this choice to propose this strategy. And so many things, many guidelines for the site itself, but they're actually very simple. So take this one, this is the last example, and then we'll finish. is an attention to absence. So in this case, orient to Haupapa, orient to the glacier. And in the literature about contemplation and melancholy, there's often this, there's mentioned the notion of the void, so paying attention to what's not there. So in this case, you're directing the focus of the trail to this glacier that's there now, but that you know is fading. And by not directing attention to an object, you don't give somebody the answers, you give them the space to ask questions. So one isn't prescribing, one's maybe giving the space for somebody to find their own. And so this is where I'll leave you. And just with a few concluding remarks, this thesis is a response to an almost ubiquitous phenomenon, and that is degrading environments. And it's saying, of course, yes, when possible, innovate, problem solve, provide solutions, but also remember to take a step back and reflect and accept all of the contradictions and the internal messiness, and accept this in others too, because it also performs work. Thank you. And that's it. Discussion?